Hey everybody, welcome to the briefing room. I'm ABC's Devin Dwyer in Washington with our senior Pennsylvania Avenue producer Justin Fischel on this Wednesday. A lot to cover today, from the Supreme Court to the White House, the president out of town. But let's start with the report everybody's waiting for here in Washington. We know a lot of Americans on both sides of the political aisle waiting to hear about this as well. Robert Mueller's report, all signs, Justin, indicate that he is very close to wrapping up.
Yeah.
In any day now, we expect it to be finished. What's your read on this?
I mean, the truth is we really don't know, but I must say, to give you a little insight here, we're bracing for it in the newsroom any day now. I mean, we are ready to go. I think the president's ready to go. I think everybody is ready for this thing to be delivered.
In fact, the president's sort of tiring of getting asked about it. He was asked on the South Lawn just a few minutes ago on his way out the door to Ohio what he thinks of the report, when it's coming, and whether he thinks the public should see all of it. Take a listen.
Mr. President, does the American public have a right to see the Mueller report?
I don't mind. I mean, frankly, I told the House, if you want, let them see it. Again, I say, a deputy, because of the fact that the Attorney General didn't have the courage to do it himself, a deputy that's appointed appoints another man to write a report.
The president pretty confident. I think he wants people to see it. Suggests he's feeling pretty good about what's going to be in there.
Right, but the trick is, see, Bill Barr, his attorney general, is going to be the one who decides in the beginning what Congress is going to see and perhaps what everybody else is going to see. So this is a comment that could come back to him. We could say, hey, if there's ever a fight about it down the road, say, Mr. President, you said you wanted people to see it. It'll be interesting to see what his attorney general says about it. The attorney general, remember, is writing a summary of it, sending it to Congress, and then from there, we're not sure who's going to see it.
All right, so we await that. The president's awaiting it. He wants you to be able to see it. But meanwhile, he's out on the road. He's talking about the economy today, and in fact, shining a spotlight, one of his favorite activities, shining a spotlight on manufacturing jobs. He's in Lima, Ohio. That is where the only remaining tank production plant in America is. You see the tanks behind him there on stage. Lima, Ohio, in the western part of the state, almost to Illinois. Storied history, Justin. You are a student of tanks, used to cover the Pentagon. They made tanks there since World War II. Down to a trickle during the Obama administration. They were only making one tank a month until Trump came in.
I mean, and there were cuts, and this is something that the president has criticized Obama for heavily. But you know, they weren't used. Tanks are a conventional weapon. Storied history of the United States military. They are not a weapon of counterinsurgencies, which has been the fight that we've been in most commonly recently. And so, frankly, it did go down to a trickle.
And now the president says General Dynamics, which makes the tanks there in Lima, Ohio, says they're making 34 tanks a month. So the president celebrating that fact today. But it brought many of us here in the newsroom to be asking, do we still need tanks anymore? And that's what the question we want to put to Mike O'Hanlon. He's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, joins us now, also a military defense analyst. Mike, great to see you. So how do you answer that question? We still need these tanks rolling off the line?
We still need tanks. The answer to that is yes. We can debate whether we still need to be upgrading more Abrams tanks today. As you folks know, you say that the tank facility has been there for a long time. We've been making or modifying Abrams tanks since the 1980s. It was the signature accomplishment in ground combat of the Reagan administration, which built the so-called Big Five, of which the Abrams tank was one. So we've been either building or modifying that same vintage, upgraded, but nonetheless that same basic concept in a tank for about 40 years.
But wait a second. I thought, Mike, wait a second. I thought we were talking about cyber warfare. I thought we're talking about countering China. We need a big Navy. When are we ever going to use these tanks?
I don't know that we're going to use them, but I think one of the things we're trying to do is deter Russia from having any anticipation or aggression or ambition towards the Baltic states. Whether we need more tanks to do that can be debated. But I think that's one theater. Certainly Korea is another theater where, if heaven forbid, things deteriorate to where they were in 2017, you could imagine sustained ground combat operations there as well. But what I'm trying to do is talk out of both sides of my mouth. Tanks are needed. We may, however, have enough as things stand, and I think the Army would emphasize its desire for the next generation of vehicles more than it would prioritize modifying, let's say, 165 more tanks in the 2020 budget proposal that just came out a couple weeks ago. So when all is said and done, we need tanks. I'm not sure we crucially need the ones that are being modified right now at Lima.
And certainly, Justin, there are some political implications for the president. He wants to throw a little candy in the way of northwestern Ohio.
It's keeping jobs there. This is an area of Ohio that he won handily in the last election. However, just next door, where the GM plant is shuttering, he only won by a slight margin, and sure enough, he's out there calling for
That's a good
GM
point. A bit
to
of a
reopen
split
that
screen
plant
there. Speaking of
next
GM,
door.
let's talk to somebody now who used to live in that community, grew up in that community. Our very own Matt Furman. He's a reporter for us out in Los Angeles. Matt, great to see you. You are from Lima, Ohio. Bring us inside that community. How important is this tank manufacturing facility from your firsthand experience?
It's really crucial to the community. You know, I grew up in the 90s in the NAFTA age, where a lot of manufacturing in the city was just evaporating. I think the city lost something like 8,000 jobs from 1970 to 2000. And that's the exact time when we started building these tanks en masse. It was really in its heyday in the 80s and 90s, and then in the Gulf War. And so it was almost like when every other sort of manufacturing was leaving, this was really thriving. So when you come around to after the Iraq War, when we don't need as many new tanks, and do we really need to be building tanks, this was a really important plant to the community, to the economy in the area. I mean, the area also has a Ford engine plant, and like we've seen with GM, that's the sort of thing that you always cross your fingers every time you hear that plants are moving to Mexico or leaving the area, and luckily that one hasn't been shut down yet. But it's a very important thing to the community, and no one really wants to see it get rid of, and everyone there is very happy to see the employment nearly doubling just in the last 5 years.
Yeah, that is certainly a good thing for them. Matt Furman, thanks so much for that perspective as well. I want to go back to Mike O'Hanlon. Shift gears a little bit, Mike, because as the president was on his way out the door to Lima, Ohio today, speaking of a place that perhaps could use some tanks, he was talking a little bit about Syria, the war in Syria right now, and got a little more definitive than he has in the past. He said that ISIS will be gone by tonight. Yeah. What's your read on the situation there? I know you've been tracking that pretty closely.
First of all, I'm very glad the president has been gradually reversing course when he first promised to get out in December. And of course, that contributed to the resignation of Secretary Mattis, who was upset by Mr. Trump's apparently impulsive decision to just abandon our interests and allies there. But now President Trump has largely rolled back that decision. He still wants to streamline our presence, which has been around 2,000 troops on the ground in Syria, and he wants to get down now to about 1,000. So, you know, it's not a pretty way to watch the sausage get made, to hear him say 0 and then go to 200 and then to 400 and now back to 1,000. But it's better than getting stubborn about his initial position, making that mistake, and then just deciding to double down on a wrong policy outcome. So I'm glad we're going to keep 1,000 forces there. It gives us some leverage in the northeast of the country, some ability to help protect our Kurdish partners there, and to try to sort of interpose ourselves between Turkey and those Kurds. So it's a good decision on balance, but ISIS is not going to be gone for good. Its territorial holdings may be largely gone, but ISIS sort of is infiltrated in the communities throughout much of central and eastern Syria, and we're going to have to stay engaged in this region to make sure it doesn't come back.
And I think, Mike, you hit on a really big point, because I think a lot of the people in the Pentagon, a lot of his generals want those 1,000 forces. But today, I would point out, as he departed, he was back to saying, I want 200 forces there. He wants to streamline down to 200. That's the number he said today, and then he said 200 somewhere else
and he
in
just
Syria,
came
which is
out
a total
of
of 400.
Whatever the number, and he has been shifting on the number, he did come out of this intelligence briefing, and we're seeing a picture right here. The president, Mike, is apparently holding up a classified document. He had used a black Sharpie, I think, to cross out the word classified.
We assume, because there's sketchings off of the top where it would normally say.
But to your point, Mike, he is trying to show that the territorial holdings of ISIS have diminished significantly, but they've really just dispersed some of these fighters. The threat's not gone.
Right. Exactly.
All right, Mike O'Hanlon with Brookings Institution, a senior fellow, also military analyst. Great to see you, Mike. Always appreciate you coming in just around the corner from here. Thank you so much. Shifting gears a little bit, Justin, you know, with so much at stake in the fight against ISIS, it's sort of baffling to see the personal mudslinging and petty politics that have gripped this town the past 24 hours, a lot of it coming from the West Wing and involving the West Wing. First, there was this extraordinary Twitter brawl between the president and the husband of Kellyanne Conway, his closest advisor. Then we're seeing all this this back and forth again over Senator John McCain. And just a short time ago, Senator Johnny Isakson, Republican of Georgia, came to McCain's defense and took a pretty extraordinary and unusual swipe at the president himself. Take a listen.
It's deplorable what he said. That's what I called it from the floor of the Senate 7 months ago. It will be deplorable 7 months from now if he says it again, and I will continue to speak out, because there's one thing that we've got to do. You may not like immigration, you may not like this, you may not like that, you may be a Republican, you may not be a Democrat, we're all Americans.
So it's not something we see from Johnny Isakson, who's very much of the mind of Mitch McConnell. They don't really attack the president, but the fact that he did this is telling. The McCain attacks continue to resonate with many mainline Republicans.
Right. These are not hard statements for many of these Republican senators to think, but to say they're difficult, because you're putting your neck on the line with the president. You're risking that relationship with the president, and the president seems to revel in that control he has, that sort of mind control, that message control he has. He's daring people in his own party to come out and say, defy me on this, and I'll mark your name down.
And it's not clear much of the country is paying attention to these petty squabbles. I mean, you go out there, talk to my family in Minnesota, they're not paying attention to what the president's saying about George Conway or even really John McCain. You're a parent, though.
Yes.
One of the issues that we talk a lot about here when we see this squabbling on Twitter on both sides is the impact it's having on young people. We know the First Lady has taken up this cause, and I want to bring into the conversation now Kathy Slatingen. She's a parenting consultant and president of Priceless Parenting based in Seattle, was also someone who followed First Lady Melania Trump's recent visit to the area to promote positive behavior on social media. So a very timely topic. Kathy, great to see you. So we're talking here, we may tune this out as adults, but this kind of stuff doesn't go unnoticed by kids.
Right. They absolutely do notice what adults are doing, and it's a perfect opportunity for us to have some conversations with our kids about what's going on in real life and what we feel about it.
So, you know, we've seen so much of this on both sides, and you and I were speaking before the show about the Conway incident with President Trump and John McCain and the whole like, but, you know, what impact does that have? Does it have an impact in the work that you do there, consulting with parents about social media use on kids? Are they picking up any of this, petty banter between our elected officials?
Well, some kids certainly are noticing. It is a way for us to have a conversation about our kids about what we expect from them, because a lot of what we're seeing our elected officials do on social media are things that our kids are going to get in trouble at school if they do the same kind of thing. So they're not allowed to, like, name calling and bullying and saying, you know, all these bad things about other kids. It's just inappropriate. And so one way parents can use that if their kids are bringing it up is to discuss it and say, yeah, adults are doing this, and yeah, we don't agree with it.
You know, it's funny, Kathy. I have kids. They're very attuned to the rhetoric being used because they watch the news at night with us, and I worry that not so much that they're going to pick up on it, because from those people on social media, they know it's wrong. But I worry that they're going to pick it up from other adults who are influenced by these world leaders. I mean, is that a problem?
That the kids will pick it up from other adults?
That the kids are being influenced by their parents and other people who are being influenced by the president.
Yeah, that's certainly a concern. And it goes back to, I guess, what kind of people we want to be and how we want to treat each other. And I think with the current significant issues our world is facing, we need to be raising the bar on how we communicate with each other and how we accept and listen to each other. And name calling definitely is not the way we want to be going. And so, yes, kids can pick up on it, and sometimes and they do the same kinds of things sometimes when they're playing their games or on social media, and it's hurtful and not helpful.
And Kathy, before we let you go, the First Lady was just in your community just a couple of weeks ago talking about the perils of social media, bullying, if you will, and you were closely following that, involved in some of those conversations. Was her appearance helpful? Do you think her initiative is shining a good spotlight on this?
I think any spotlight we can shine on treating other people with respect and not bullying is great. I don't know, she kind of flew in and out of here, got to see Microsoft, got to see some of the parental controls and some of the new things that are available for parents. So that's helpful. It's always helpful to have the conversation, for sure.
Have those conversations. Good advice. Kathy Slattingen, a parenting consultant, president of Priceless Parenting, based in Seattle. Thanks so much for your time. Great to hear your perspective and appreciate you. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Well, now we, back here in Washington, turn to the Supreme Court and welcome in one of our guests with us today, Samara Freemark of American Public Media. She is a senior producer with the podcast In the Dark, which was tracking one of the significant cases that was before the Supreme Court today, Samara, focusing on racial bias in the criminal justice system. An incredible case. Justin and I were talking about it this morning. This is the case of Curtis Flowers, who is a 48-year-old Mississippi man on death row, been there for 22 years. And he alleges that in the count them, 6 times he's been tried for the same quadruple murder in 1996, he faced what he calls racially biased juries because of, in his words, the prosecutor, Doug Evans, was involved in some discriminatory behavior in picking those jurors. You were in the courtroom today at the Supreme Court. How were the justices responding to his argument of racial bias?
Well, you know, it can be hard to tell what the justices are thinking. You don't want to predict too much based on their questions, but I think it's safe to say that they seemed pretty troubled by the history of this prosecutor. So, as you mentioned, this is a case that has had not just one trial, it's had 6, and over the course of those 6 trials,
which is unprecedented.
As far as we can tell, this stuff isn't tracked, I should say, but yes, this is not common to have this many trials for the same crime, same prosecutor, same defendant. So over the course of these trials, the prosecutor, Doug Evans, has been caught committing all kinds of prosecutorial misconduct, including striking black jurors because they're black, which is unconstitutional. He's actually been caught for it in 2 previous trials. And I think you could tell from the questions today at the court that many of the justices were just deeply troubled by this.
Including potentially Justice Clarence Thomas, who we should note, just as an aside, asked his first question in the courtroom in 3 years, someone who is famous for being silent.
That's remarkable.
An indication of the significance of the case. I do want to bring in our Supreme Court analyst, Kate Shaw, for a little bit more in this conversation, because as Samara was just mentioning, Kate, at issue here is the jury selection process in criminal trials and the use of these techniques called peremptory challenges, which allow both lawyers on either side in a case to strike jurors for any reason. Help us understand a little bit more about that process and how it may be prone to abuse.
Sure. Right, either side of a case has the opportunity to remove jurors without explaining why, right? So that's called a peremptory challenge. And only if the other side raises an objection to the challenge do you have to put forth your reasons. So if the other side says, hey, you've now struck 3 prospective jurors, all are black. Why did you strike them? Then the side that made the strikes has to come forward with an explanation, and it needs to be a race-neutral explanation. But the problem is sometimes race-neutral explanations are offered, but just to conceal what are actually racial motivations. And so that's what we've seen in several of these prior cases, courts finding that this prosecutor, Doug Evans, did in striking black jurors. He, of course, didn't come forward and say, yes, I struck these prospective jurors because of race. He offered other explanations. Well, they knew one of the witnesses or the victims or had a connection to the defendant or, provided some kind of explanation. But a lot of those explanations applied equally to the white jurors who weren't struck. But it's a tricky process because you still are allowed to do this thing called peremptory challenges. And some people think that those just shouldn't be allowed at all. You shouldn't be able to remove someone who's a prospective juror without giving some explanation up front, and that it's prone to abuse and to manufactured explanation. So that's the basic background.
Yeah, and it makes a very complicated fact pattern in this case, Samara, because In the first trial, it was an all-white jury. Second trial, almost all-white jury. Each of those cases, it was tossed out because the Mississippi Supreme Court said, well, there was some misconduct there, not fair. Third trial, same thing. Fourth and fifth trial was more diverse juries, and they were gridlocked, so they didn't convict him. And then they got him on the sixth trial,
which was also 11 to 1,
11
white
to 1,
black.
white jurors to black jurors. So today, though, one of the things that the justices grappled with was the context of Doug Evans, the prosecutor's behavior. I think we have the numbers. American Public Media, your podcast In the Dark, which is a fabulous listen, everybody should download it, did an analysis in Mississippi. You spent a lot of time there looking at 418 cases or more of this prosecutor and his practices of using peremptory strikes. You found 4.5 times higher of strikes against black jurors than white jurors.
That's right. So you would think that this might be the kind of thing that was tracked because it's an important constitutional issue. So you would think you might be able to go to a computer and look up how many black people does my local prosecutor strike off of juries. But it's very difficult to do that. Very few places actually track that. So to answer that question, the question that we wanted to answer about Doug Evans and his office entailed this months-long, almost a year-long data project where we had to literally track down transcripts in 8 courthouses, old men's bathrooms, abandoned storage containers, old jails. I mean, these documents were kept in some crazy places. But assembling all of these transcripts, 115,000 pages of records, performing some data magic on all of that, coding it, entering it.
You uncovered this pattern.
And at the end of the day, or the year, we were able to say we have found that Doug Evans strikes black jurors at 4.5 times the rate.
Did the justices catch on to that today, or did they put much water on that?
So that information was included in briefs that were filed to the Supreme Court as part of Curtis Flowers' petition. But the justices were very narrowly focused today specifically on what happened in the 6th trial, though again, in this larger context of the actions of the prosecutor over the past almost 3 decades.
And I must say, Samara, as someone who just started looking at this case today, what's really fascinating, aside from these issues of race, is sort of the seeming lack of evidence. I mean that is on the substance. That's what draws you into the case as well.
Yeah, and I will say the Supreme Court is not here to assess the evidence against Curtis Flowers. That's not its role. But that's something that we did in the podcast, and the evidence against Curtis Flowers is very weak.
No witnesses, no murder weapon, no physical evidence, and the one person who says there was a jailhouse confession was sort of a suspect figure.
Close.
Potentially.
Very close. Yeah, there was no physical evidence. The case was almost entirely circumstantial, with the exception of this one jailhouse informant who said that Curtis Flowers had confessed to them when they were in Parchman Prison together. In our podcast, we were able to reach this informant, Odell Hallman, on a contraband cell phone from his cell in Parchman Prison, and he told us that that was a lie. He had made it up to get a break on some charges he was facing.
So potentially that could come forward if there was a 7th trial, and I want to put that to Kate Shaw before we wrap up here. Kate, depending upon, it does sound like from Samara's reporting that the justices were sort of inclined to strike down this conviction of Curtis Flowers. That could open potentially a 7th trial for this man?
Yeah. You know, it seems totally possible. One, the fact that the court took the case up at all. It doesn't typically take a case like this just to affirm what the Mississippi Supreme Court did, which was to allow the conviction to stand. And I'll also say that this is an area of law in which even the Supreme Court's conservative justices sometimes will side with a criminal defendant. So Roberts wrote an opinion 2 years ago finding a Batson violation, that is discrimination in a juror strike. Alito wrote an opinion in 2008 also throwing out a conviction because there had been racial bias in removing jurors. So this is a case where you might not even see, a 5-4 outcome, but it seems at least conceivable that you might have, 6, 7, or 8 votes in favor of sending the case back for yet a 7th trial. And I will say I would be very surprised if the state of Mississippi allows Evans to go forward again as the prosecutor, because despite being reversed time and time again, he previously had been given the opportunity to retry the case. Seems like a questionable choice on the part of Mississippi, and I don't know if they would make it again if the case went back for a 7th trial.
And we should hear their opinion, I think, by the end of the term here
should be by the end of June.
So it'll be very interesting to see. Samara, thank you so much. Samara Freemark with American Public Media and In the Dark podcast. And, of course, the fabulous Kate Shaw, our Supreme Court analyst, who joins us on a very busy Wednesday. Thank you so much, Kate. And finally today, as we kick the show, a little bit of good news for music fans. If you're a lover of some of the greatest hits in American music history, country, Justin. I know you are. You turn up those tunes when you're
Always.
driving out of here.
Yeah.
A number of them were inducted today into the National Recording Registry at the Library of Congress. Well, what is that? Well, they preserve some of America's greatest songs for posterity in government archives. That means if a meteor strikes the Earth, those things will be in a vault somewhere, preserved forever. You're seeing some of the great ones there. September. Love
Devin,
that
are you going
one.
to sing? Is that what's happening?
I will not be singing on the
Okay,
show
because
today,
that's
but
really all
maybe
we're
we can hear a
interested in
little
here.
bit of Sweet Caroline, which was added, Neil Diamond's 1969 hit. And believe it or not, if you were a fan of Schoolhouse Rock, that got inducted today, too, into this recording registry. We have a little bit of that for you, because who's not a fan of Schoolhouse Rock? That's going into the Library of Congress. You can see the full list. Check out all those songs on the Library of Congress website. 20 of them added today. Fun stuff. Maybe we'll be added in there one day here in the briefing room. Digital content that'll be preserved for posterity. Hey guys, we're here every day, 3:30 Eastern Time on ABC News Live. Download the ABC News app for the latest on these and all the stories we talked about today, including the Supreme Court case that is so fascinating. I hope you'll be back here with us tomorrow. For Justin Fischel, I'm Devin Dwyer. We'll see you next time.
Sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's